You're listening to Advice from Your Advocates, a show where we provide elder law advice to professionals who work with the elderly and their families.
Welcome back to Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Mannor. I'm a board-certified elder law attorney in Michigan. Excited about our guest today. We have Nicole Smith. She's the author of Diagnosis Dementia, Your Guide for Elder Care Planning and Crisis. And we all need a guide if we have a loved one with dementia. Welcome, Nicole.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so I am a caregiver in the sandwich generation. I'm caring for 3 aging parents, 2 have dementia, and I have 5 children. One's still at home in high school. And about 5 years ago, my world went sideways when my mother started having issues, and I started flying across the country and trying to learn the languages of caregiving, the financial, the legal, the medical, the emotional, the practical. And I couldn't find a book that I was looking for to kind of guide me. I mean, there are definitely books out there. And so as I went through this process, I started taking notes and writing things down and evaluating things. And I felt I wanted to share it with others that are in my situation.
Yeah, that's great. And you have a really interesting background too. Tell us a little bit about your background that helped you. And then after that, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced when you realized that your mother had dementia.
Yeah, so I graduated with a business degree from the University of Texas in Austin, and I worked in corporate for about 10 years. I did a little bit of sales, a little bit of training, a little bit of auditing, a little bit of everything. And then when my husband and I got married and we started having children and moving around for his job, I was fortunate to be able to stay home with my children. And then as they got older, I was not looking to go back to work because I still needed a flexible schedule, but I volunteered with a global nonprofit, Room to Read. And when I was sharing speeches and spreading the word about that, I joined Toastmasters to become more effective at public speaking. And then I was reading, and then I started writing articles. And then so when all this happened with my parents, I was kind of already working on another book and then segued into this book and got it out there.
You know, it's really interesting when we have authors. I'm always curious about, what you learned from the process of writing that book. So, there's always what you learn from having to just deal with life and deal with trying to arrange, care for your mother and then eventually your father and stepmother. But what was that process? What did you learn from that process of also trying to then boil that down to a book that would be interesting?
Yeah, well, I call it like the Wild West of elder care right now because there's, it's a giant space. And obviously people have been suffering from dementia for decades. But with the baby boomers aging, that 73 million people mass force, that it's becoming more and more in the forefront and prevalent. And I just felt that there was a need and a growing concern. And since I was already in kind of the book world and the reading world, I knew I wanted to do it professionally. So I hired a professional editor through a connection. I hired a professional designer through a connection. And then my niece runs a boutique branding firm in the Midwest. And so she designed the cover. But there was a lot of frustration. I mean, anytime you're doing it, because I self-published, which was my choice. And I learned a lot. And one of the things that comforts me is one of the things they say to prevent dementia is lifelong learning. And so I just keep learning all the time with everything I do. That's
great. I like what you said there about the Wild West of long-term care. And I think that's very true. It's amazing how much and how little information there is at the same time. And so what I mean by that is as soon as you start talking to people and telling them, hey, I need to help my mom, I need to help my dad, and you get a lot of information. Now, some of it is from people that have something to sell, right? People that there's the marketers, all of the assisted livings and independent livings and things like that have marketers, and there's nothing wrong with that. They need to promote their residences and things like that. But it can be a bit overwhelming with the folks that are just trying to sort through all of it and figure out what is the best setting. What's the difference between independent living and assisted living and nursing home and adult foster care and all these different things. It's just so much information. At the same time, I think there's so little information in sort of distinguishing those. So it tends to be that we kind of group all those together and they serve different purposes. A memory care serves a different purpose than assisted living or adult foster care. They serve different purposes and work differently with government programs even. And so there's so much information kind of coming at you, and it seems like everybody you talk to has different advice. And yet at the same time, getting clarity is hard because of sort of a lack of nuanced information.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm about ready to cry. Just all the emotions are coming back up because yes, I say it's like learning 4 new languages simultaneously under duress. You have to learn the medical terms, the financial terms, the legal terms, the elder care terms. So I was fortunate in that a good friend of mine, my son's good friend's mother, had been in the elder care industry for 10 years. She managed a CCRC, a continuing care. And so I didn't even know what she did. And then when this happened with my mom, I'm like, oh, that's what you do. Help me with my book. I was like, I need to organize the overwhelm because it's hard to figure out what are the good resources. So when I was going through this and I was flying back and forth between Jersey and LA and, these long flights and it was kind of a cathartic process for me to write about it. And then in certain situations, like when my mom was in the psych ward, behavioral health, and I couldn't speak to her, then I was processing and writing about that and my feelings. And I started to investigate and I would find resources. I was like, well, this is a good one. I don't feel like this one's very clear. I did training and in internal audit, you had to process, you had to interview people and understand the process of their workflow. And so I felt like I used my discerning repertoire, I think, for what I thought was clear and easy and concise. And someone like myself going through this massive emotional overhaul and being clueless and scared and worried. And what did I find the most straightforward and easy and reputable resources for people to use? And I used podcasts and books and movies and websites and anything that I found that was good, I put it in my little working Word document. And then when I shipped that off to my editor with all of my narrative, then we honed it down to a compelling book that's both our story and the navigating the acronyms and the different fields and how do you find an elder law attorney? How do you find a care manager? How do you figure all this out? Because it's hard.
Yeah, that's great. And it's great that you're using that hard fought knowledge to help others get a head start on that because it's so difficult to know where to start. I did want to clarify one point. You mentioned CCRCs. That is a term of art for our listeners. Regarding some of the government benefit programs and things like that, a CCRC is a continuing care community where you can start out even at sort of in the independent stage of things all the way up to, 24-hour skilled care all in one community. And it is a specific term of art. There's different places that sometimes have different levels of care, but that's not necessarily a CCRC. A CCRC is a very specific thing. Now, I mention this and I clarify this because they are very popular in many states. In Michigan, they're not particularly popular, oddly enough. We only have a handful of them that's within the geographic scope of my primary office, and they do exist, but they're not as common as they are in many other states. I've heard from other elder law attorneys that in other states that's kind of the go-to, that's the standard level of care that a lot of communities are working with.
Well, and the acronyms changed. So it used to be a continuing care resource community, and now it's a life plan community. But then there's also the distinction where some of them are you buy in, like a capital investment, and you buy, and then the other one, like where my mother's in memory care, it is a month to month. And I know that, and a lot of these terms are used interchangeably because I asked the question, I said, well, if it's a rental, what's it called? And they didn't really have an answer for me. So, and then there's different terms used in different parts of the country. So it's very confusing.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that we try to get the message out there to both our clients and Mannor Law Group and from just to the general community, and particularly because we do a lot of education within the healthcare community with social workers and nursing home administrators and nurses and care planners and discharge planners, all of that. We provide education, their continuing education for them. One of the things that we're always trying to make sure people clarify is the distinctions between the different levels of care. And it's important, it's probably more important to me in the analysis that we do than it is to the average person, but we try to clarify because people come in and they think that they can get certain government benefits, whether it's, Medicaid or veterans benefits or waiver benefits or, whatever the benefit that they're looking for, and they assume that they can get those in any setting. And so one of the things we try to clarify is, number one, we can probably reduce the noise a little bit by limiting it to those places that are suitable for your mom, suitable for your dad or your aunt or whoever it is that we're planning for. Because if you're starting to look at independent livings and they need 24-hour care, that's possible, but it's going to be really darn expensive and it's very unlikely. So we can probably kind of limit those. And so I think it's really important to do that distinction between the different levels of care. This is the type of thing that I'm imagining that you had to figure out from yourself, having never gone through this before you started helping your mom.
Yeah, and fortunately, I had my friend who kind of educated me, and I also just received my certified senior advisor designation because I just wanted to learn more. But yeah, no, and then the terminology is also scary for some people. Like, well, no, my mom's not going to memory care. Right. She's not going to memory care. And I mean, my mom was a flight risk, and and again, she fought us on everything, and I didn't, so I'm learning the whole language. I'm learning the process. And then the other thing is that we had to so a lot of people's like, should I get diagnosed? Should I not? It's important. Maybe it's not. But we had to get a diagnosis because we had to get her declared incapacitated to invoke the terms of the trust so that we could literally save her from herself. But as you know, doctors and lawyers don't really mix, and the doctors don't want to write these letters, but the lawyers need these letters. The only reason we were able to get the neurologist and the primary physician to sign off on these letters is that my aunt has been a nurse for 50 years. She worked in the LA market as a hospital administrator, and she developed a relationship. She had the medical POA. She was in the portal. She was talking with these physicians, and it took us still 9 months to get those letters.
That's shocking.
And yes.
So that's very interesting, especially for someone like you say that was a flight risk. That's one of those red flags where we automatically say, okay, they lack the competency to be able to manage all of their own affairs if they have a tendency to wander or could get lost, type of a thing. That seems like a bellwether that any doctor should be able to recognize. That's not been a particular big problem here in Michigan. Usually we get those doctor statements. Sometimes it takes a little bit more because if the person hadn't seen a lot of doctors, and typically we need 2 doctor statements. But that's interesting that in some areas of the country that becomes more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and that was the other thing about with my mom, like everything that we did was so incredibly difficult compared to other people we're talking to. I'm like, well, because you just can't put it down. It reads like a suspense novel. I mean, she got her license taken away, but she was still driving, and she was obsessed with the DMV, and we couldn't take away, we couldn't disable the car, but then we tried to take the car, but then the police were going to arrest us because she reported it stolen. Like, so she was just cognitive enough to be really, really difficult through all of this. I mean, I could go on with 100 stories like that.
Yeah. One of my pet projects that I eventually would like to do is to do some training for first responders. And I understand that I don't understand the first responders' job. I'll be the first one to admit that they have a very difficult job and they have to do it a certain way. And so that they sometimes are resistant to anyone, saying, okay, well, but certain parts of the community need a different approach. If you approach someone with Alzheimer's or with certain other disabilities, that if you approach them in the same way that the first responder typically approaches, which tends to be fairly aggressive, that can result in very negative things, or even responding to things like, hey, we have to disable this car for the safety of our mom. That seems like if they that's certainly something. If they got a regular call that said, hey, my kid's disabling my car and and stealing parts of my car, any first responder would probably say, hey, that's criminal. But there's context of it. And so I've not had much success yet with the training of first responders, but I do think that would be a nice addition to their training to say, okay, let's look at to see whether there's any signs of dementia, of Alzheimer's, of significant mental restrictions that would impact how this person's going to respond to your approaching them.
Yeah, well, even then, like, we eventually found the right person within the police unit that does. But then, even then, like I talk about in the book, when we had my mom in the ER being evaluated by different psychiatrists, they would come back and say, she's fine. What are you talking about? Because a lot of people with dementia, they can rise to the occasion. Yeah. And my mom had worked in healthcare hospitals. She knew to throw around the HIPAA word. So I literally had trained psychiatrists and doctors and professionals saying, well, why is your mother here? She seems perfectly fine. And so that's when I whip out the letters and the documentation. And oh my gosh, it was maddening.
Yeah, that can be particularly difficult for someone that was probably, very educated and well-spoken like your mother, because that doesn't always go away and they can cover quite well. And, depending on the type of dementia, we see that often with something like Lewy body dementia, less with Alzheimer's, but depending on the person, they might have those skill sets, those personality skill sets to be able to cover and sort of, like you say, rise to the occasion. That can be much more challenging because, if the people at that particular time don't see it, but you say, okay, but these are it's not safe or not consistently safe. Right now she's rising to the occasion, but at, 3 a.m. she might try to, go out and get her mail and then get confused and wander away from the house.
Yeah, well, she was hunkered down in her house, but she would get up in the middle of the night and yell at the coyotes and try to go out there and tell them to go away. And then she was opposite of my stepmother. So my stepmother's in Iowa, and we said, hey, she has aphasia, and we're like, hey, you probably should stop driving. And she's like, okay, here's my keys, I'm done. Opposites. And I'm sorry, there's a million stories. But finally, when we got my mother through the psych ward and admitted to a memory care unit, and she was still upset with us and whatever, but she got on the right meds for anxiety, the right meds for, she's not on that many meds, but she's on the right mix of meds. So she's more even keel because anger and feisty and assertive doesn't even begin to, fully encompass how my mother was.
And I know some people are get nervous about, and we certainly wouldn't want to have meds that sort of zombie somebody out. But there's a difference between that and kind of taking that edge off where they're overly aggressive or that there's behaviors there. And sometimes meds can be very effective with regard to that. It's just sort of monitoring that, and that's what I think you're saying that you do, is to make sure that it's the right, it's the right levels and the right amounts and the right drugs that still allow her to live her life, but kind of take that edge off where she was, more aggressive.
Yeah, well, this was at a behavioral health facility for elders in New Jersey that with a highly trained geropsychologist or what. There's so many specialties, but he worked the magic. Whatever he did, it worked and it helped. But she still was mad and upset, and I'm not going to memory care, and wouldn't get out of the car when we got there. The stories continue to go on.
I think their listeners are going to be very, that this is relatable to them. A lot of people are dealing with family members that it's hard. It's particularly hard. One is that I think that as we age, none of us imagine we're going to get to, we kind of imagine we're going to retire and then live happily ever after. And that's kind of the story that we're told. That we're just not prepared for that. People aren't prepared for the idea that there could come this stage of life. And then secondly, the person, well, they might not have been prepared for it. They also now have limited ability to adapt because of the changes in their brain chemistry. And so I always tell folks, especially when it's a husband and wife and the spouse is, saying, oh, well, my husband's just grumpy. This is just the way he is, and it's like, okay, well, it's more than that now, once there's been a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia or something like that. But it can be, I think people will relate a lot to the story that you're telling with regard to your mom. I have a funny story. You mentioned about your stepmom and that she was very compliant. And so growing up, my dad was very dominant, and he did it his way, and we all, kind of complied. And I remember at one point, several of my siblings were working with the law office. And at one point, my brother said to me, if we ever have to take Dad's keys away from him, I'm not doing that. You can do that. And we kind of had a laugh about it. What's funny with the story is that when he got to a certain point, he lacked confidence, and he chose to give up his keys and sell his cars. He said, I'm just not driving anymore. And I would have never guessed that in my entire life, because he loved driving. He loved traveling. It was one of his favorite things to do. We as a family drove all over the country as kids, and in a motorhome, and he just loved that travel. I think he loved the travel more than the destination. And the fact that he voluntarily gave up his keys was a huge surprise to me, even to the point where I was saying, Dad, you can still drive. You can go to the grocery store. And he's like, nope, not doing it anymore. And I was like, okay. So you never know what to expect. And you might have the very gentle parent that all of a sudden becomes very stubborn with the onset of some memory issues.
Yeah, and it's losing your independence, right, for driving, and she's fiercely independent. And then being in the sandwich generation, so at the same time we're trying to take the car away from my mom, I have teenagers that are getting their license and having fender benders, and so we got all this going on. And then again, when I mentioned my mom was in behavioral health for the psychotic break and trying to manage the meds, and then within the year, my daughter is in behavioral health for anxiety and depression. So
wow.
It's literally the sandwich, I'm in the sandwich, the meat of the sandwich. And then the other thing I was going to talk about is, so my mother had all of her documents done. She, powers of attorney, trust, will, everything. And so then I turned my focus on my dad in Iowa, and I'm like, hey, Dad, we're going, just checking here. Do you have all your stuff done? No, not a single document. And he's 80, not a single. And I'm like, wait a minute. But he said, no, I'm not doing it, because if I do my will, I'm going to die, and I'm not going to do it.
Oh boy. Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, great. So then I fly to Iowa, and I hire my own elder care attorney, and I tell him, I'm like, I'm going to meet with this guy because the states everything's different. Laws are different in every state. And I just need to know what's coming, because I'm going to prepare even if you're not. And then eventually but again, it took 18 months to get him to come around to saying, okay, yes, I agree that we should do this. So then I started down that,
That's so important. And so if you're the child, if you're a family member, if you're, even yourself that don't have those legal documents, I talk about the lifetime documents, and then, the after death documents. Lifetime documents can be your financial power of attorney, your healthcare proxy, maybe some privacy waivers, maybe a trust. But the idea, those are so important, and it changes when folks come to see me in a crisis. And a lot of people wait till the crisis until they come to see me. The cost, the effort, the anguish, the time that it takes, everything is easier and smoother if they have those documents in place before the crisis. And if they don't, it can increase the cost and the time to do planning and, to get things in effect. Sometimes we end up having to rely on the judge or the court to order the right person. And sometimes if there's at all sort of a family dispute, the judge might just pick a stranger to make those decisions. And so it is just so important to get those things in place before the crisis.
Yeah. And I also had the sibling issue. So my sister and I didn't speak to her for 2 years when we were going through this, because she was being difficult, and she said, well, you deal with it, I'm not dealing with it. But then proceeded to tell me how I was doing everything incorrectly and badly and poorly. And I have a brother, but he had moved away and kind of wasn't really social with the family anymore. So what my elder law attorney in LA said, he's like, you fit the mold. One has their hand out, one is checked out, and one's left with doing everything. Usually the eldest daughter, which, hello, that's me. So that's where I am.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit more. I know this is a big issue for lots of folks, but the stress of that sandwich generation. And, we talk about that. It's been around for a bit, that's been a conversation. But I think it's one thing to be the sandwich generation when you're just trying to make sure you keep an eye on your elderly parents, but it's another when you throw in the dementia diagnosis. And so that adds a whole different level to a sandwich generation conversation. So tell us a little bit more about the stress associated with that.
Where do I begin? I had the distance aspect. So I'm fortunate that I am a communicator and I have resources. So I mentioned my aunt has been a nurse for 50 years. So she's my medical confidant. My husband has been a CPA for 40 years. And so anything to deal with taxes or finances or accounts, like he's my go-to guy. And then I have, a friend that's a financial advisor that helped with all that. And we're lucky that, so my mom could not afford to stay in her house, even though she thought she was a gazillionaire 20 times over in her mental state. But once we sold her house in Los Angeles, right at the pandemic bubble, she sold it for a lot of money. And so now we're able to take care of her, and she can be in memory care, which is so expensive. And that to me takes a huge load off, is that she's got the money to pay for it, because as you know, Medicare does not pay for long-term care, and you're either wealthy enough to pay for your own care, or you're poor enough to qualify for Medicaid and sick enough, or the forgotten middle is the one in the middle, dealing with children and parents, and you're in the height of your career trying to experience and build your nest egg, and then everything goes sideways because your parents are not behaving normally. And people don't realize memory or dementia is not just memory loss. It could be behavior, it could be mood, it could be executive function. So people don't recognize it because it's not, mom forgot my birthday. I mean, it's so much, it can be so much more than that.
Yeah, I did want to clarify one thing that you said as far as Medicaid. Like you say, Medicaid can pay for long-term care where Medicare does not. It is the reason why you said that correctly. What I wanted to clarify was, and it's particularly because it's something that we do in our law office, is that we help people not have to go into that. You had mentioned you're either rich and you can afford it, or you're too poor and you can qualify for Medicaid, and everybody in the middle. That's what one of the things that lawyers like I do is we help people find those ways within the law to protect their assets and still qualify. A lot of what we do. So I hear this out, and occasionally if there is a conversation about protecting assets, it's always, oh, well, you have to do it 5 years in advance, or you have to do it you do it this certain way. A good portion of the planning that we do to help people so that they don't become impoverished is what I call crisis planning, meaning that we don't actually complete the planning until the crisis occurs. And in pretty much every state, there's going to be options for that. Now, they're not perfect options, but it is one of those things that I want to make sure there's that's sort of a myth that you have to be impoverished to qualify for Medicaid. There's many ways to protect those assets in pretty much every state in the United States and still qualify. And they're legal ways. They're ways that are built into the law or have built in through the court process, where we've, through court proceedings and things like that, we've created these paths of being able to protect assets and still qualify for Medicaid, which I think is very fair, because if you think about it, if you have open heart surgery, it's probably going to be fully covered, right, by Medicare and by your supplemental insurance. But if you get Alzheimer's instead of heart disease, then they say, well, you have to go broke first. Well, that's where an elder care attorney can kind of level the playing field and make sure that you don't have to become impoverished because you got the wrong disease. And so it's just something I wanted to clarify, particularly because it's something that we do in our law office.
No, well, absolutely. And it's so different state by state, right?
It is.
So
it is.
You have to be aware, and people don't plan, and they have their perception. Well, I don't want to talk to an attorney. Attorneys are expensive. Right. I'm like, well, you're going to end up spending a lot more in probate or in grief or in, you need to find the people that are educated in this field to walk you through the legal process and understand what documents you need. That's why I tell people, don't go to LegalZoom to create your legal documents, because the nuances and you need That's why my whole book talks about build your network, build a team from friends, neighbors, family, and paid professionals, right? So it's so important to get the right resources. Otherwise, you're going to create a bigger problem for yourself down the line.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I always like about my work in this field is that it is usually the cheapest option. So
Yes.
we say, okay, lawyers are expensive, absolutely, and we're not an exception to that. We are expensive, but it's usually the cheapest option because otherwise it's private pay until you run out of money, and that's not ideal. I want to hear more about the book. I'm really interested in it, and the idea that it's a guide for folks and helping them through these stages that you went through, and you had all these resources and all these friends and family that you could rely on. A lot of families don't have that. So I think your book can really help out. So the book, again, is Diagnosis Dementia, Your Guide for Elder Care Planning in Crisis. Talk to us about how your book can help families that are just starting out on this journey.
Sure. It's elder care planning and crisis management because, yes, we encourage people to have the conversations and to start early. But as you know, human nature, people just are going to avoid what they don't want to deal with. And so you often end up in a crisis. So my book is kind of a combination. It's prescriptive. So it kind of talks about what to do and how to do it and why to do it. And it's also a memoir because it talks about everything I went through, my mom, my dad, my stepmom, and all. So it brings it home. Like this is probably the worst possible scenario, but this happened to us and this is what can happen. And these are the signs we missed. And this is what we learned. And so it's very well organized. It's organized by section, by chapter, and the table of contents is very clear. So this is a little book. It's like you can stick it in your purse while you're at the doctor's office waiting and review the section on legal or the section on medical or the section on finance. And also the resources that I usually send people to are, you probably know, the AAAs. So the area agencies on aging. Yes. Are all over the country, and they're federally funded through the state, and they are a wealth of resources for people to kind of figure this out. And then the other thing that I really found or learned that's so valuable are these aging life care managers who are private pay, but they are social workers and nurses, and they know the system. You have to learn the system. And the one system I had to learn that I didn't want to learn was Medicare for my mother and all of that. That was so horrible. I know enough to be dangerous, but it's still very scary, the Medicare piece. Anyway, so I like the AAAs and I like the aging life care managers as like the immediate kind of resources to kind of start to figure out what to do and how to do it. That makes sense.
We talk about it as a maze. We call it the elder care journey, but really it's the elder care maze. And I actually have a sort of a picture of all the different bad things that can happen. And it kind of, when you lay it out on a picture, it kind of looks like that old kids board game, Chutes and Ladders, where you think you're making progress, you're almost to the top, and then you slide all the way back down to the beginning.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, no, I mean, we went through some shoots and then, worked our way back up the ladder. Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
Talk to us a little bit about the importance of the caregivers, and you had an extra struggle because you were, at least at the beginning and still to some extent, had been a long distance caregiver and trying to go back and forth and set things up where you're not living in the same state. But the importance of taking care of yourself, of that self-care, because it can be overwhelming, and the person that you're trying to help won't be helped if you get sick, if you break down. So the importance of caring for yourself and making sure that you're not overdoing it yourself when you're trying to care for a loved one with dementia.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always turned toward exercise to manage my stress, and like physical and mental stress. And so that has been something I've done my entire life. So I was never an athlete, I played on a couple little teams in junior high or something, but I was not, but I have always made it my priority to exercise at least 30 minutes a day, like 4 to 5 days a week, because that's my reset. That's my clarity. And even with every one of my 5 pregnancies, I worked up doing aerobics or worked out right up until the day of delivery. And then I was back at it like a week or two later, because again, that's my absolute go-to. And everyone's got something different. Maybe it's music, or maybe it's cooking, or maybe it's reading a book. But as you probably know, 30% of caregivers die before the person they're caring for.
Yeah.
And so the one place that I found that's absolutely fabulous is daughterhood.org. And I am a circle leader for Daughterhood. So it's a virtual support group that's national. But I also, one of the first support groups I ever went to was through an elder law attorney in New Jersey, because they offered one. And so the AARP has them, and the the AAAs. There's the Y. There's plenty of support groups out there, some churches. So find a support group as well, because you are not alone, and everybody wants to know that they're not alone. And then you can share resources. You can cry and vent and feel heard and seen. And so find your thing, but also find a support group is what my advice is.
Excellent advice. And, I wanted to commend you on your book, and the idea that you're telling your story in the book. It makes it much more readable that way. If you're just trying to give tips and advice, that's harder to take in if you don't understand the context of it. And I think being relatable, and people, having, similar experiences, or even sometimes lesser experiences, where they say, okay, well, she had it even worse than I, and she got through this, so it's going to be okay. I think that's a really important part of your book. In addition to the tips and the guide, is telling your story as part of it. So I commend you on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, it's unbelievable, the stuff that we were just in disbelief of what we were going through. And then I gave a talk not long ago, and the one woman on there, she said, Nicole inspired me to keep going. Because,
Nice.
You're not alone. Yes, it's difficult, and everyone's different, but, there are people out there going through the same thing. They understand, they relate, and there is help out there, but you do have to take a little bit of extra effort and energy, which you don't really have, but it's worth it.
Yes, very good. Well, as we start to wrap up here, can you kind of give us some key takeaways from your book, and what people should expect if they buy your book, and how that would help them with their family?
Yeah, well, all through the book, I say, have the conversation, start the conversation, approach this subject, because I had the same thing. These are my parents, I don't want to ask about their finances and their health, and that's very personal, and that's their thing. It's not my thing. But I had to steal documents from my mother's office and rush to the library to copy them. And then I wish I would have stolen more things. I mean, but it was very, very difficult, because I felt like I was betraying her. I was being a bad child. But it was all in her best interest, but that doesn't make it easier. So if you can have these conversations in a gentle way and approach it in the more time you have, you're going to need time, because you can't show up for Thanksgiving and at the table be like, hey, let's talk about death. And it just doesn't work that way. So start the conversation. And then what I've had people tell me is, if you're listening to me right now and you read my book, you feel like you're talking to me, because I definitely am a very conversational tone. Like I tell people, I'm not a physician, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a social worker. I am a daughter, talking from the daughter perspective, sharing exactly the frustrations I had and what we did, and then what showed up next, and how we worked together to handle it. And there were a lot of tears. I mean, a lot of stress. And I mean, like I said, I am still in it every day. I am living the life of the whack-a-mole caregiver, because literally something comes up every couple of weeks that I did not even expect. And then I have to figure it out.
Well, tell us about where we can find you on social media, and where we can get more information and stay connected with you.
So the main place to go is my website, njsmithbooks.com. And everything is on there. But I love Instagram, and because I'm a big reader and also now an author, but I review all kinds of books on Instagram, and my handle is at Dementia Book Review. And so once I started reading more, I started posting my little reviews, because what I found was there are a lot of books out there talking about how do you interact with someone with dementia? How do you alter your behavior? How do you caregive? And I was like, yeah, that is all important, but what about getting the legal documents and the financial documents? And my dad had stock certificates from the 80s in his drawer. And I mean, you need to figure that stuff out and ask the questions and investigate, but you need time. So anyway, Dementia Book Review on Instagram. And I love LinkedIn, Nicole Smith, type in, or just go to my website and then that links you. But I definitely am a connector and a speaker, and I love LinkedIn. So connect with me on LinkedIn if you're on LinkedIn.
Very good. So the primary website is njsmith.books.com with an S at the end. And the book title is Diagnosis Dementia, Your Guide to Elder Care Planning and Crisis Management. Thank you so much, Nicole, for coming on, and we appreciate you with all your insight.
Thank you. I learned some things today too. I appreciate it.
Now, if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe. We're on anywhere you can find podcasts, or if you prefer, you can go to our website at mannorlawgroup.com, or we're also on YouTube. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, visit mannorlawgroup.com.